Thanks for staying with us. Now, South Africans continue to be punished by the rising cost of living. The Reserve Bank has hiked interest rates again by 75 basis points. The situation will affect those struggling most to repay their debts. Experts are encouraging consumers to try and tighten their wallets to discuss how consumers can save and plan for the future in these trying times, if they can even save during these trying times. I'm joined by David Kop from the Financial Planning Institute of Southern Africa. Thank you so much for your time, David.
Evening.
We do appreciate you coming through. Let's just start off with whether or not there is capacity for South Africans to save at this stage. I know I said in my introduction, planning for trying times, planning for a pandemic where people's salaries were cut or they unfortunately lost their jobs. But given what we are seeing in our economy at this stage, is it possible for us to really save?
Anything is possible with a bit of planning. And this might be in the category of a little bit too little, too late. But there's always a thing saying the best time to start saving was 20 years ago. If you're not, then tomorrow is the best time to start saving. So one of the things that we see is, and if we look at the data that came out of the FSCA Financial Literacy Baseline Study from 2020, only 46% of South African households actually have a budget. So the most important tool that consumers have in their arsenal at the moment is your budget. And when you start looking at your budget and your spending habits, you might find that you're spending money on unnecessary things that you can start putting to the necessary things to help combat the cost of living.
So, for example, when you have a budget, and you could maybe elaborate on this, you can look at if you have subscriptions to certain things that you don't need, or you have accounts that you should be paying off but you aren't, but you're adding to. How much of that is important to look at and consider when you're trying to save and also manage your budget?
That's vitally important. And one of the things we see is that if you don't have a budget, your money is controlling you as opposed to you controlling your money. So, for example, when I started working, I was just spending my money. And when I sat down and did my budget, I figured out that my spending habits, just buying lunch every single day for work, was costing me about 250 Rand a week. Okay. Put inflation up, that's probably closer to about 500 or 600 Rand a week. So by changing that small habit, I freed up about 1,000 Rand in my budget. So that's why it's important to actually analyze where you're spending your money and make sure it's going to the things that are important to you and not the things that are just funding a lifestyle which may not be important to you.
Certainly. I think it's also about people trying to live above their means, which does become problematic. But it's interesting, you touched on the fact that you were spending money for lunch, 250 Rand a week, and today, because of load shedding, I mean, a lot of people are unable to cook or plan because the load shedding schedule sometimes very off, or there are trips and you aren't being load shed, but you just don't have electricity. But I want to speak about how you plan for unplanned circumstances. So, for example, you said buying lunch, or if you have to drive to a different for work to different places and you haven't budgeted that petrol allowance, which becomes problematic. How do you plan for that, and how do you factor that in to your savings and your monthly budgets?
So the best plan is to have an emergency fund which can cover between 3 to 6 months worth of your expenses. Now, like I say, this might be advice a little bit too little, too late, but that is always the starting point. If you haven't got there, quite often it's about planning your trips and thinking about where you're planning. So instead of just saying, oh, I forgot something and I'm going to shoot to the shops quickly, you can't just jump in your car now. So you have to think, well, if I'm going to go to the shops or I've got to go somewhere to work, can I add something else into that trip which will help the petrol budget go a bit further because I'm combining things that I'm doing in one go?
You spoke about an emergency fund, and I would say that a lot of South Africans say, I don't have capacity for an emergency fund. I don't have capacity for a savings fund. But maybe just some advice about actually sitting down and looking at your finances and saying, instead of buying, I love dresses, so instead of buying a dress this month, let me rather save that 400, 500 Rand. And there are smaller ways to actually save, and at the end of the day, saving that little can accumulate to a lot.
100%. And people obviously saving as a sacrifice, but it's not a sacrifice, it's just spending in the future. So if you want to buy that dress, plan for it, put money aside, and then go buy it for cash. So you can still achieve and you can still do what you want to, but it's about planning for it. Now, to help South Africans with this, the Financial Planning Institute hosts Financial Planning Week every year, and it is running from the 3rd to the 7th of October. We'll be hosting a lot of workshops, a lot of information on our social media to give more tricks and tips for consumers during these times.
Lovely. I think that will be extremely vital. I want to ask you about how dangerous accounts are, clothing accounts, whatever it might be, but also your credit card, because as we just heard, interest rates have gone up. People are going to be paying a lot more for their bonds and their car installments. And you might think, oh, it's just 75 basis points, but that accumulates to a lot. And that takes away from you needing to save or wanting to save, because now you're paying more for these things. But maybe tell us the importance of not tapping into that credit card, not tapping into those accounts, because what I find shocking now is, I won't mention retailers, but they'll actually send you a card and say, you can have this clothing account and it's all set up for you. And, the temptation is there. Yeah,
no, it definitely is. And giving into that temptation is hard. So debt, when used responsibly and used correctly, can actually help you in your financial plan. But the plan and using it responsibly is what's quite key. So just because you've been given a clothing account, just because you've been given access to credit, doesn't mean that you should use it. Because you are in that situation where if you do sit with credit card debt at the moment, your monthly expenses are just escalating because of the rising interest rates. So again, it's about responsibly using that credit and making sure that you're using it to further yourself and not putting yourself further in a hole.
Just lastly, everything is going up. I was so shocked the other day to see the cost of fresh milk, because people aren't buying fresh milk anymore. And I thought to myself, what is happening? So it's very difficult to save when everything else is going up. But maybe just some tips around, despite the fact that food prices are going up, petrol's going up, electricity is going up, even though we load shed 90% of the time. How do you manage that?
Yeah. So again, it starts with your plan, and it starts with going towards...
So budget is key.
Budget is key. Okay. Budget is 100% key. And like I say, it's looking and saying, where are the things that I can cut back on to put some money away towards savings? And yes, there are simple things you can do. My wife started baking our own bread at home at the start of the pandemic. It was a bit of a problem getting yeast when everyone was making their beer, but we got there. So it's changing those habits, because baking a loaf of bread is probably cheaper than buying a loaf of bread. That's if you've got the time to do it. So it is changing some of those habits and looking at being creative, and most importantly, having fun with what you're doing. So going back and learning how to bake your own loaf of bread was a fun exercise for us.
Yes, I think finances are always stressful. There's not a lot of fun when it comes to finances, because the reality is a lot of people live from hand to mouth, and it's a huge challenge. Just very quickly, David, just tell us about, you were speaking about these tips and programs that are coming up in October.
Yes.
Where can we find them? How can people access them?
So we've got a website called www.letsplan.co.za. In that, we've got a lot more information and some of the things that I've shared tonight, where people can go on that. And then during the week on the Financial Planning Facebook and YouTube channels, we'll be hosting at 12 o'clock every day live sessions where we'll have some of our certified financial planner and FPI professional members actually going through some tips in terms of managing, how to talk to your children about money, managing risk in your life, and then looking at, if you do get to a point where you can save and invest, what your options are with regards to saving and investing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming through and giving us some of those tips, and some word of advice to myself: save for the dress, just don't go out and splurge. Thank you so much. We do appreciate it. That is David Kop from the Financial Planning Institute of Southern Africa.